Hey everyone, Larissa here, just wanting to invite you in to learn a little bit about the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Noble Path. Next month, we'll talk about the Eightfold Noble Path a little bit more, but essentially, the Four Noble Truths are very, very simple. And it's not always easy to hear this first one. I've often thought to myself, I wish there was a different principle that begins the Four Noble Truths. But it's in its simplicity, it's just that suffering exists. And we're not talking about always like the big suffering, the grief that we experience, loss, etc., although that is definitely a part of it. We're also talking about the lowercase s, things like I have a hangnail, or I was sitting here enjoying myself one moment, and now all of a sudden I'm caught in a worry loop, and I don't know why that's happening. These are all forms of suffering or pain or discomfort. And in Sanskrit or the original Pali, it was called dukkha. And the word dukkha, when we translate it, if we pull the word apart, the beginning part, du, oftentimes is translated as bad. It doesn't necessarily just mean bad, but there's a negative component to it. It's something that is challenging. It's something that creates dis-ease in us, or something that's causing some suffering externally. So when we're looking at that word dukkha, it means negative space. Or if we look at it literally, it could also relate to a wheel, and it literally means empty hole. And sometimes we feel that. We even talk about things like, man, I feel like I have a hole in my heart. And we describe suffering as something like that. So when we're talking about this idea that suffering exists, it sounds challenging. It sounds kind of crappy. But in reality, it is the truth. And it's helpful to recognize, oh my gosh, I'm not the only one that's suffering. I'm not the only one that said something silly in the meeting. I'm not the only one that's experiencing this anxiety when I wake up in the morning. I'm not the only one that had a terrible thought about somebody else, and I wish that nobody knew that I had that thought ever, ever, ever. But then sometimes we judge ourselves for having the thought in the first place, and then there's this internal suffering that happens. So suffering is across the board a very challenging thing that we just experience as humans. It just exists, and that is the first noble truth. The beauty of that, I've heard Pema Chodron say, thank goodness somebody told the truth, because we can recognize and we can connect around this simple fact that difficulty exists. It's just part of being human. The good news is the other four parts, or the other three parts, we have suffering exists. We're also looking at there's a cause to suffering, and then it's the practice of understanding suffering. So there's a cause to it. Part 3, there's an end to it. That's the best news. And then part 4 is the end to it is the way through it. And the way through it is the Eightfold Noble Path, which again, we'll talk about a little bit more next month. But this month, we're working with those 4 simple concepts. They're not always easy to work with, but they're quite simple. And we'll dive into how do we start to understand suffering. So we'll utilize our mind, working with our mind a bit, but we'll also spend a lot of time just being with our body, noticing when does a little bit of discomfort arise in our meditation, and how do we actually deal with it instead of pushing it away or avoiding it or trying to come up with something fun in our mind to pay attention to. It's really this process of just moment by moment listening to ourselves, paying attention to ourselves, noticing when like, ooh, this warm, cozy sweater feels really lovely. And now all of a sudden this warm, cozy sweater feels too hot and I'm uncomfortable. And it's recognizing that that's just a part of being human. That doesn't mean we've done anything wrong. But the truth is, just like Pema Chodron said, thank goodness somebody told the truth. Suffering exists and it's a part of being human. And it's okay that we're experiencing difficulty in our lives. Then we have the practice of understanding suffering, moving through it in a conscientious way, and eventually starting to understand that there is an end to suffering as well. So join us if any of that calls to that human part of you that sometimes feels like, I wish I didn't have this much suffering. This sucks. Dealing with, okay, how do I deal with the suffering at hand in order to experience more joy, more connection, walking that broad, wide middle way so that we're moving into a place in our life that we can have stability, groundedness, support, and all of the joy that exists around us, and we can actually experience it.